afternoon. We'll do this as best as we can, as if we're in the same room. We're not, but without any further ado, let me just hand it over to you, Steven.
Okay, let me just click on Present, Window, Web Content Authoring, Share. How's that look?
It looks very good. Web Content Authoring, Steven Pemberton.
All right, great. So, hello. So I'm Steven Pemberton. I'm a researcher at the CWI, which is the Dutch National Research Institute for Mathematics and Computer Science, where I've been working for 40 years. I'll tell you a bit more about it as we get through the slides. So in 1988, the internet came to Europe, November, and I was lucky enough to be the first user of the open internet in Europe. And that's because the CWI was the first European open internet node. They set up a connection to North America with the amazing speed of 64 kilobits per second, connecting all of Europe with all of North America. But luckily, all of Europe at that time was me and a handful of other people. I was the first user. That's because I was the first person who didn't set it up, who logged in, and that's because I was in the office next to the guy who set it up, and he knocked on my door and he said the internet's working, and so I immediately logged into a computer in New York just to try it out, and I said yes, that's great, good. And that was sort of like the historic moment that we didn't realize was so historic. We'd already been using internet protocols in-house to connect computers together and so on for remote logging in and stuff like that. But this was the first time we had an external connection to the internet. Up to that point, we'd had an international email system, a store and forward system, so that we could send mails internationally, but that was very slow and very inconvenient to use. But at least we did have it. In 1989, they doubled the speed of the connection, to much rejoicing. But in fact, since then, the speed has almost doubled per year. As a result, we now have the world's fastest internet connection, currently peaking at 14 terabits per second. This is a graph from yesterday, which I just took to see what it's peaking at now. What I loved about this graph is that you can very clearly see Christmas Day and New Year's Day as two dips just before January. It's really interesting to see. And actually, it was also interesting to see during COVID how instantly the amount of throughput went up. So 1991, only 3 years after the introduction of the internet, we got the web, and it was really the coming of the internet to Europe that enabled the creation of the web. So Tim Berners-Lee and the lesser-known Robert Cailliau, both of them pictured there, at CERN, had the first web server running in 1991. I know that Tim Berners-Lee prefers to use 1989 as the date of the start of the web, which was the day he first thought of it, but I prefer to use the date of the first web server running in 1991. So I of course, being on the internet, I got involved with that right at the beginning. And in 1994, there was the first web conference, so I helped organize workshops at the first web conference at CERN. And that's where Tim Berners-Lee recruited me to help with setting up W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. Of course, the CWI had a website already in 1994, and one of the first 500 websites in the world. So pre-web, but post-internet, so in those 3 years in between, there wasn't much you could do on the internet. There was FTP, which you may know, a primitive method of serving documents to others. So you just had to download the file to your computer before you could use it. And there was email and chat programs on the internet, but not much more than that. Several research groups at that time were experimenting with hypertext systems, but they weren't yet connecting them to the internet. So there were only a couple that connected to the internet, the web being one of them. One of the clever things, which I think gave it some leverage about the Tim Berners-Lee's web, was including all the existing methods of delivering documents like FTP in the repertoire of access mechanisms that could be used. What this meant was that you could build a website with existing content that you already had there in your FTP server, for instance. You could build your website really quickly, and I mean, within an hour, I had a website running. So that was a real advantage. You didn't have to do much for that very first website to have content online, because you just use your existing content. Of course, the other clever thing that the web did was or the Berners-Lee did, was making it free, because a lot of its competitors were required license fees, and so people would migrate or converge on the web more easily than the other ones. So now let's talk about content authoring. So the web at that time was actually very advanced. It used the Latin 1 character set rather than ASCII, which gave it 256 characters rather than 128. Email at that time, and DNS even now still, only used ASCII, which meant that at last you could use accented letters. And I have a number of friends who could at last represent their name on a computer in a proper way. Unicode wasn't there yet. The very early days, 1991 was the first draft of Unicode published. It had then 65,000 code points, which they thought was going to be enough. But then it turned out that 65,000 code points wasn't enough. So then they went with 21 bits, which now gives us more than a million code points for characters. HTML, the markup language of the web, was also advanced for the time, because it was principally a document description language and not a presentation language. Now, a lot of people didn't understand this at that time, in particular the browser manufacturers. But what it meant was that, well, it meant two things. You were describing the document, so you were saying this thing is a heading, but you weren't describing how it should be presented, and that was then up to the browser to do itself. This has its plus points and its minus points. The minus points, of course, that you had very little control over presentation, but the plus point was that you could, for instance, have an audio browser that read the page to you, and it knew what it was reading. The initial HTML didn't support embedded images. You could only have images by linking to them, which you then clicked on and got in a separate window. And there was little to no control over presentation. You had bold and italic, and then you had big and small, but that was about it. It wasn't until the addition of images and tables to HTML that people started doing stuff with presentation, and unfortunately misusing the facilities they got. They would use spacer images to sort of separate words, and they'd use tables for positioning. Browser manufacturers, also not understanding how HTML worked, started adding presentation elements to HTML, like font and so on. So W3C saw it as an urgent issue to introduce style sheets in the form of CSS in order to protect HTML, so that HTML could still remain as a document description language and not as a presentation language. And of course, it makes presentation easier, since you don't have to touch the content, and you can have a house style for the whole website just in one file, and you don't have to change all the individual files to match. In fact, I chaired the very first style sheets meeting, and I was a member of the CSS working group right from the beginning. In fact, Netscape was opposed to style sheets, so it refused to join that working group. Netscape at that time being the leading browser, and they thought that they had the power to direct the web in the direction that they wanted to go. But luckily, Microsoft saw adopting style sheets as a way of getting its foot in the door, because it had rather missed the internet at the first stage. It had rejected it, and it wasn't until '95 that they suddenly realized, oh no, we've made a mistake, and now we need to make a sharp U-turn and get into it. So computers get about 10 times faster per 5 years at constant price. That's been fairly fairly steady increase since the 70s, which means 100 times faster per decade. So now we've had the web for 3 decades. So the computers today are around 1 million times faster than then. So that picture is the very first web server from CERN. That was actually on display at a W3C conference, it was a reception in the Louvre in Paris, which is why there's a glass of wine there, because I put my glass of wine down so I could take the picture. So because computers were relatively slow then, typically a computer would be reserved to the web server, and they would call that computer www. And that's why so many URLs still start with www. People started thinking it was an essential element of the URL, even though the very first 2 servers at CERN didn't use www. But anyway, www was the name of the machine that hosted the web server. As computers became faster, people started wanting to host more than one server per computer, but the design of HTTP hadn't foreseen that would ever be the case. That's the web protocol. And so they had to update HTTP first before it was possible to have more than one server per computer. Now, computers get faster at a rate of 10 times per 5 years, but network speeds get faster, even faster. So they approximately double per year at constant price, which is about 1,000 times faster per decade instead of 100 times faster, which computers get. So now networks are about 1,000 million times faster than they were there. I should say that although that's the case, I'm talking here in wholesale prices, and I can't say that that we as users are seeing that major reduction, which we should be. It means that the network companies are actually pocketing some of that advantage themselves, because networks should be cheaper than they are at the moment, because of this this increase in speed at constant price. But anyway, what it means is that in the mid-90s, networks were really slow. And there were complaints that www stood for World Wide Wait. What it meant was that if you were designing a website, you were going to have to design content for the lowest common denominator of your users. And typically that would be 1,200 baud telephone lines to approximately 1,200 bits per second telephone lines to homes, which meant you couldn't have very many images. And certainly not large images. And well, although video really wasn't available yet on the web at that time, but that was absolutely out of the question. The other lowest common denominator that you had to design for was the browser that users had. So, for instance, in the beginning, before Unicode, before tables, before ping images, you had to wait until there was a critical mass of people who had them before you could actually support those things, because otherwise you'd be creating a website that nobody was able to look at because their browsers didn't support it. Now, in the case of ping, that was due to an error in the design of HTML. That the error is still there. If they designed it right, you would have been able to use ping, but we had to wait. The nice thing about star sheets, though, was that they were designed to be backwards compatible. And so pages would still display even if the browser didn't have CSS. So that meant that you could use CSS at a very early stage, even though the browsers weren't there yet. I should also mention in passing that the web was designed in those days to be read-write. Early browsers could edit as well as display pages, and that was a deliberate design. And the idea was that at home, you would serve pages as well as just read them. The idea was that it would be a read-write web. Unfortunately, the first major popular browser, which was Mosaic, didn't implement that part, didn't support that part. And so in order to allow that read-write aspect, you started getting server-side solutions instead, which has meant that the web has become far more centralized and that your data ends up on other people's machines. instead of being distributed as intended. It also meant that we were confronted with passwords everywhere, but that's another talk altogether, and you don't want me to get worked up about that here. In the early days, so all early websites had a webmaster who was the person responsible for maintaining the content, running the site, doing backups, keeping logs. And the nice thing was you could always get in contact with a webmaster of a site, because every website has an email address, webmaster@ for contact. There were no dynamic sites at all. There was no JavaScript at that stage, so all content was static. The only way that you could get any sort of dynamism or interaction was to use the common gateway interface to run programs, which allowed you to supply data for a program that then got run on the server. But of course, this doesn't scale at all, because once you've got 1 million people trying to run a program on your computer is going to grind to a halt. Naturally enough, in those early days, there was no content management at all. There were a couple of editors, and so you could do WYSIWYG editing if you wanted, but it meant that you had to either author everything by yourself or devise a content management system yourself. So in 1995, I was editor of a magazine that was published in New York. And it was one of the first magazines to publish simultaneously on paper and online. That's it in the picture there, the SIGCHI Bulletin. So when these slides are online, you can click on that link to see how we went about designing it. You can click on that other link to see what's left of it, as it were, online. But anyway, of course, a big website like that with lots of issues and lots of articles per issue was a big management problem. So I devised a content management system then using the Unix make command. And if you're interested in that, there's a link there to an article I wrote explaining how that worked. And so we come to the present day. And frankly, I'm very critical of the design of HTML5 because it's got some big design errors in it, and really the people who designed it were not good designers. They were more programmers than anything. Amongst the design errors that they made was, rather than doing research about what websites needed in terms of functionality, they said, we won't supply that functionality ourselves, but if you need it, then you can add it by programming it with JavaScript. What this has meant is that we've now got a huge number of frameworks if you want new functionality. This has given two bad results. One is that content is less sustainable in the long term, and by that I mean you have to realize that most of the information that's being produced these days turns up on the web rather than in books. In books, books ended up in libraries, and if you need to see some information from 100 years ago, you still can by going to the library or by finding a copy of the book. But I'm really worried that in 100 years' time, a lot of the content that we're now producing will have disappeared simply because of the way that it's now produced. And my personal view is that all information that gets put on the web should stay there forever, because deleting information from a website is the same as burning a book. Worse in a way, because it's the only copy of the book that you're burning. The second problem with the HTML5 design is that there are now essentially 20 different versions of HTML, each single sourced and non-standardized and licensed, because each framework is come from a different source. This means that when you choose one of those frameworks, you lock yourself into it, because if you want to use a different one, you have to rewrite your whole website. So there's no standardization anymore, which is one of the reasons behind standardization, is so that you can change between suppliers without any disruption. It also means that if you look at the code on websites these days, it's really disgusting mess of divs and spans and not much else. So anyway, in conclusion, It's a mixed bag, really. The early web was simpler, easier place, but less support, and browser makers definitely muddying the water. Now, much more is possible, but the browser makers have messed it up again. They're really not very good at designing. My dream for the future is that the design of the web goes back to the users and not the browsers. The browsers only know about implementation, but they're not very good at knowing about how the web is used and how the web needs to be used and what people want to do. And the web becoming, again, a truly distributed space, not owned by the big companies. Content management will always be needed. There's nothing you can do. I mean, that magazine, I will always need something to help me manage that. But it can, with the right design of the web, be easier than what we have today. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Steven. I think you offered a lot of interesting background and also a couple of directions where we could digress, network speed, passwords. But I will go in another direction because in my early days of working with you in the late 90s, there was also a lot of creativity. And so I can't help but think that in the early days, the web was a more technical place. It was more geared towards in my book, like more technical role of being a webmaster. But I also saw amazing creativity, like from folks like Kathy Marshall, who did hypertext literature. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit from the knowledge you might have on how did that happen back then when you wanted to be creative with web content authoring?
Well,
did it require you to also be a programmer?
No, you definitely didn't need to be a programmer. But of course, in the beginning days, we hadn't seen any of these things before. We'd got this new platform to distribute information. And we didn't have any language. We didn't know how it should be done. We still had to discover all these things. So with that magazine, for instance, our first action was to work out, well, what does the user of an online magazine need? Because we only knew paper and magazines, and we didn't know how going online and to screens affected the user's needs, the user's abilities. Maybe the way that a user would use a magazine. So there was a 6-month study period where we did research into what would happen if you did this, or what would happen if you did that. So it was an exciting time. I mean, it was a true revolution because all of a sudden lots of new things were possible, and we had to experiment. So there was a lot of experimentation. You're right.
Yes.
I don't think you needed to be a programmer necessarily. I mean, I think now you need to be more of a programmer than you did then because of JavaScript. But people did a lot of crazy things because experimenting means you have to try it out to see whether it works or not. You can design something, but it's only in the usage that you actually work out whether it works or not. So there was a lot of experimentation going on, much less than now, because now we've sort of worked out the language of the web and the design principles and so on. So we know much more about how to do it.
Great. So I see there's quite a lot of reminiscence in the chat about tables and how they can be used. I will ask just one more question, Steven, and then if anybody else has questions, let's go ahead. But perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the EMEA browser, which was, I think, the browser that also enabled read writing, right?
In fact, that's I used that to create my slides.
You still use the EMEA browser? I
still use it. Yeah. Because it's free. It produces very good quality code, HTML. I mean, so I still use it. Unfortunately, under Linux, it's getting harder and harder because with each new version of Linux, they change something in the APIs, and it doesn't work. So I actually have to use it in a Windows emulator. I have to admit, to continue to use it. There are some alternatives, and one day I'm going to have to change. But for
those who haven't seen it before, I think you can basically envision it like opening a Word document, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like Word, except the output format is HTML. It has style sheets. So in fact, I use that as my day-to-day day-to-day editor, because I did use once upon a time, long ago, FrameMaker and Word. And my problem is that I can't read some of those documents anymore. And I think that HTML is the document format that has the chance of lasting the longest. And so I really want my documents to be readable for as long as possible. So I write all my papers in HTML. I do all my slides in HTML. I write my letters in HTML. I do the whole lot. I think it would be great if there were an editor like Word, sort of the quality of Word. I mean, Amaya has definitely now is now old. But it would be great to create an editor that allowed people to get away from Word and start producing documents in a format that nobody owns and that has a chance of a long future.
Yes. Thank you, Steven. So we do have a little bit of time. If anybody has questions, comments, reflections, fond memories of using spacer.gif.
I'm just curious, Steven, have you heard of the nascent Gemini protocol?
No, I haven't. I don't believe I have. But
it's interesting. It's very much under the radar, but it's an attempt to replace HTTP and HTML. And it's interesting because it's really back to how the web originally worked. It's text only. You can have hyperlinks, but they have to be on their own line. You can't embed hyperlinks in other text. It doesn't support images. I go out there. There is kind of a hobby community of Gemini, people running Gemini servers. And so it's kind of like this alternet in a way. I'll put a link in the chat, but it's interesting because, I got on the web in 1985. So kind of just after I was born. And it reminds me of the web back in 1995. A lot of hobby pages, very, very content focused, no presentation to speak of. It's refreshing in a lot of ways. And I enjoy it for that reason. I'll put a link in the chat. It might be interesting to look at.
Great. Thank you. Let's go to Italy. Matteo.
Okay, so it was very fascinating. Congratulations. I started much later than you. I started in 1996 with the internet, with the editor Hot Dog Pro by Sausage Software. It was not a bio-like editor. So font, face, Arial, size free that moment. And soon after, I set up my first server that I put physically bring to the local service provider. And so it's very fascinating for me that the first browser were meant to be read-write. This is very fascinating for me because my mission today is to bring back this sort of experience. So what I'm creating now is really a CMS where you can navigate the website, click a button, and edit like if you were in Word or Pages. So directly over the HTML, but save structured data in JSON. Of course, there is JavaScript involved. We cannot do without it today. So it's a React component and properties of React component behind. But I think that it's really fascinating that this was the original idea of the web. So thank you very much. It was very interesting for me.
Thank you, Matteo. And we are right on the nose in terms of time. Thank you very much also from my side, Steven. That was an amazing history lesson. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. I will do the normal thing of sharing the slides and the recording. And we'll just finish with saying thank you once again, Steven. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Great. Nice to see you.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Good to see you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steven.